get to discuss things.
I find my way to the power source. Brightest day and blackest night. No evil shall escape my sight. Let those who worship evil's might. Beware my power, Green Lantern's land. Ring capacity 46.1. Ring capacity 58.9. Ring capacity 64.5. And now I'm charged.
Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of Geeky Gentlemen. I'm Sid Part 2. Joining me today is...
A geek for fun.
Indeed. And today we're talking about one of my favorite characters in comics, the one and only Kyle Rayner, the Green Lantern, the Torchbearer, Ion, the White Lantern, and everything in between. So I kind of wanted to talk about Kyle because we just did the Geeky Gentleman on the Nightwing story, Better Than Batman. And in that, we were talking about how Dick Grayson has had so many roles over the years, and he's changed so much, and he's like a legacy character living in the legacy of Bruce Wayne and all, yada, yada, yada. It's a whole thing. Go watch that episode. And it really got me thinking about Kyle Rayner, and how, in all honesty, Kyle Rayner has had the same thing over a much shorter career, so it's kind of hilarious. And that's kind of why I introduced him as all those damn titles. The Green Lantern, the Torchbearer, Ion, the White Lantern. He's had so many different roles, and he's only been around since the 90s. It's kind of crazy. But Alfie, what's your familiarity? What's your exposure with Kyle?
Well, in general, anyone who's heard Ian berate me for my lack of Green Lantern knowledge, I'm not really familiar with that universe to a large degree. I don't normally read individual Green Lantern stories, but I have read Kyle, albeit in two small things, but probably some of the two things he's known the most for outside of Green Lantern stuff. So I'm familiar with him in Morrison's JLA, and I'm also familiar with him in Tom King's Omega Man.
Oh, okay. Yep, Omega Man's another really... Oh, the Omega Lantern, there's another one. Yeah, Kyle Rayner has had an interesting history. All throughout the 90s, he was the kid who just wasn't as good as Hal Jordan, even though everyone, if you were to objectively look at Kyle's career, he was so much better than Hal Jordan, it's not even funny. And he was in this weird place post Green Lantern Rebirth where they weren't quite sure what to do with him, and he got to kick around in the Green Lantern Corps book, and was that was more of an ensemble cast book, but he was one of the more main focused characters in that. And then once New 52 kicked up, they took a really bold direction with Kyle that I really, really appreciated, and I guess I was the only one. And then we got Omega Men, which is really interesting, but is also a very, very different direction to go in with him. So yeah, Kyle's kind of all over the place, and that's kind of why I find him interesting. He is, in my opinion, the best Green Lantern, to the point where he was too good, and he graduated to another corps. The way I looked at it, I thought that was really cool. Yeah, Kyle Rayner. So I don't know. Where's a good place to start? Do you think, Alfie?
Well, I feel like the best place to start is because he's had, like you said, he's got a long history, and although I haven't read a lot of these stories, I'm familiar with just geek facts of what he's done and all his stages he's been in. So I feel like the best example is, okay, why is Kyle Rayner made? What is the purpose of Kyle Rayner? And do you think he was justified in being created?
Oh, I mean, absolutely. It's funny, everyone complains about how many human Green Lanterns there are, and in all honesty, it is getting a little ridiculous, but that was kind of the trick. Every 5 to 10 years, it was originally every 10 years, now it's every 5 to 10 minutes. The Green Lantern book would get a little stale, and we'd introduce a new human Green Lantern. The problem became we didn't kill off the old ones. So, at first we had Hal kicking around, and then Guy got to, like, fill his shoes every so often, but he wasn't, like, permanently a Green Lantern. And then John took over the book for a while, and Hal was kind of in the background. And then, for whatever reason, Hal became the mainstay again until he got really, really bland, and then they handed it off to Kyle. And I don't know, like, it's just... Kyle was the Green Lantern on his own for the longest, besides Hal Jordan. John Stewart had a stay in the books for a while where he was the Green Lantern, and then it kind of ended. Guy was the Earth's only Green Lantern for very short periods of time. More when, like, Hal was laid up by injuries. But Kyle really, like, held the role in a significant way for a long time. The only real comparison out there is Wally West. Like, Dick Grayson became Batman, sure, but it was only for, like, a year and some change. Kyle was the Green Lantern for, like, 10 years. And that's, it's a big deal. Longer than 10 years, almost 15 years. So it's a big deal. It has some weight to it. And so, like, the choice to make Kyle the Green Lantern, I think, was really well deserved. Like, a lot of people will kind of crap on Emerald Twilight and New Dawn as kind of character assassination for Hal Jordan, and when you read it, I definitely feel that there is the sense of a mandate to make Hal a bad guy so we can get rid of him. But at the same time, it's like you really feel that Ron Mars, who was writing it at the time, I believe, you really feel like he was like, okay, I'm going to do it, but I'm going to do it the best I possibly can. And, like, Hal Jordan recreating Coast City in construct form because he just couldn't deal with losing the whole thing. There's something deeply interesting and tragic, and then, like, it gets so cosmic and so big with Hal Jordan killing the entire Green Lantern Corps, and then it ends, or the middle of the story ends with Ganthet going to an alley in New York and picking some kid that just stumbled out of a bar and saying, well, I suppose you'll have to do. And Kyle getting the ring is such this interesting little subversion, and it's kind of always really worked for me as just this, like, whoa, the stakes have just never been higher at that point.
Yeah.
Everything... Go ahead.
No, it's like Green Lantern as a myth and as, like, a fantasy. If you just take the Hal Jordan, Guy Gardner, John Stewart idea, it's being given this power and then being brought into this global universal organization, and being able to fly higher and further and faster than you ever wanted to, have all this power at your fingertips, and anything you can imagine can come do, and you can conquer your fears through, like, a group effort and through the solidarity of that. It's a very different fantasy than what they then turned it into with Kyle, when they very much go Luke Skywalker with it, where the Green Lantern is no longer this active force in the universe. It's now mythicized because it's no longer around. So it almost feels more important when Kyle's trying to live up to the legacy than when the legacy's still around.
Yeah, I guess I'd never thought of that, and that kind of works for me with my feelings on Star Wars, sometimes I feel like such a weird Star Wars fan because I'll hear people be like, oh yeah, Rogue One, a movie without any Jedi stuff, and like, Han Solo's my favorite character. I'm like, am I the only one that likes the laser swords? I don't get it. That is a really good point. I guess I never really thought of him in the context of the Luke Skywalker, like, oh, the Jedi are a myth kind of thing. And yeah, that kind of is Kyle Rayner in certain lights. He's this little nobody kid. I love it. It's funny that I have such an admiration for Kyle getting the ring, even though I haven't read much of him when he was just the only Green Lantern. I got into Green Lantern like everyone else, it seems, through Jeff Johns bringing back Hal Jordan and everything. but I still really always liked Kyle a lot more, even though I've not read a good chunk of that stuff. But at the same time, there's, he's kind of off on his own. He's like the true underdog. And for all the stories out there about Hal Jordan being the greatest Green Lantern and like a legendary Green Lantern of his time and all this stuff, Kyle's always impressed me so much more because he had nothing going for him. Like, there was no one to train him, there was no one to teach him anything, and he just went out and did it, and in my opinion was better than Hal ever was. When you just look at some of the stuff he achieved. Working with the Justice League, the kinds of stuff he would make in that Morrison run were so fascinating. The choice to make Kyle Rayner an artist, to give the most powerful weapon in the universe where the only limit on it is your imagination to someone with an active imagination was such a great decision. Creative decision. I always really appreciated that. And just you'd see all the crazy stuff he'd come up with and tinker with and make, and sometimes it had its moments where it's like, oh god damn it, it was the 90s, so like 90 or like 2 out of 3 times he'd make a construct and there'd be like a scantily clad woman in it. I'm like, fucking Christ. Like, that shit got a little old, but I don't know, like that kind of thing with Kyle always really worked for me. But
it does seem a lot like the only Green Lantern who focuses more on the idea of imagination rather than conquering fear. So I think that's why he was probably the one. You know more about this because I don't actually know how he became a White Lantern and all that stuff, but he always did feel like the one who would be the only one who could evolve past just the idea of your will. He was always bigger than that because he was more linked to imagination and creativity.
I always really appreciated that about Kyle. And what worked about it is kind of the origin of Kyle being given the ring just in an alley. The ring didn't choose him. Ganthet did, that kind of thing. John's, every time that Kyle and Sinestro interact, Sinestro calls Kyle an alley rat. And that is just so perfectly undercutting Kyle's place in the Green Lantern mythos. And then for him to be able to leave the Green Lantern Corps behind and go and figure out, the legendary power of the White Lantern is just, it really, really worked. It was so good, and I was the only one who read it. And then in DC Rebirth, we just put him back, give him the green ring, and it's like, okay, whatever.
So it's gone now. Like, he isn't the White Lantern anymore.
No, he's a Green Lantern in Rebirth.
Oh, damn.
He gave it up. Yeah.
I'm so sorry, Ian. I literally was just complaining like last time we did this. I was like, oh man, Dick Grayson isn't a spy anymore. What a downgrade that is. Carl Rayner was like a god.
Yeah.
Oh god.
So
I feel for your loss.
Yeah, no, in the Green Lantern New Guardian series, it was one of those books in the New 52 that I was the only one who was reading the good books in New 52. It has a really great opening arc, or opening issue, actually, where Kyle's just kind of going around town, doing his thing as a Green Lantern, and then all these other rings from all the other colored corps just show up and say, Kyle Rayner, you have the ability to instill great hope. Kyle Rayner, you have great rage within your heart. Kyle Rayner, you have the ability to instill great fear. Kyle Rayner, you are loved. Kyle Rayner, you want it all. Like, all these rings come up. Kyle Rayner, knock. For the Indigo, I think is all it said. All these rings just come up to him. He's like, huh? And he tries to go to Oa and talk to the Guardians. And, like, the discussion gets kind of heated. And that's the moment where all the rings put themselves on his fingers. And for an instant, he's got the power, but he can't channel it properly. He's kind of like a faux White Lantern. He looks more like gray at the time, and like all the symbols are popping. Yeah. All the symbols are popping up on him, and he just can't contain the power. And then like all the rings just break because they're so in conflict with one another. And then all these other people from the different cores come like, where did our rings go? What did you do with them? And Kyle's like, shit, no, I didn't steal them. It wasn't me. They just came to me. And so that kind of like sets us off on the mystery. And as the story kind of goes on and on, they have to like learn to work together. And Kyle eventually has to learn how to use each of the emotions. And there's this like really great scene, and it just feels so, Jedi-y, as you say it, where like he's talking to one of the Indigo Lanterns who, they can channel all of the emotions one at a time, though. He's talking to one of them, he's like, I have no problem feeling the positive emotions like love and hope. It's the negative emotions I have a hard time with, like rage and avarice. And Indigo, like, it's such a Yoda moment. It's like, you can't see them as positive and negative. They're all part of all of us. And it's just like, and so once he kind of gets that, then he's able to use all the rings at once and create a white ring from it. And it's just the coolest shit. I just remember loving that, because like the second, you can't help it, the second Johns introduces the emotional spectrum, you want someone to use all of them at once,
Yeah.
It's like, it's this very, very primal thing, and it could have just been Hal, or it could have been John or Guy, and the fact that it was Kyle, and it was handled with such like an interesting kind of almost spiritual feel to it, just worked so damn well. And I was the only one that liked it. No one else read that book. I kept telling everyone, oh man, go read this book. And like, I'm not the only one, obviously. Like, I remember some people were like talking on forums like, oh man, how cool would it be if they did like a line of action figures of Kyle in each of the different uniforms? Because there's like a short arc of like 7 issues where he's going to each leader of the Corps, and they're teaching him how to use the different rings. And so you get Kyle in each of the different ring color costumes kind of thing. And it's not just like, okay, it's this Green Lantern outfit, but it's orange. Like, they actually experiment with it and do some kind of cool, crazy stuff. And then it's like, okay, yeah, we could get one of each costume and then one in the white costume. And the real killer of it, I mean, I could check real quick, but I'm still pretty damn sure there's never been a White Lantern Kyle action figure.
I think I've seen a couple.
You might see some customs.
Because that's the thing is, even I, who's not a Green Lantern fan, I'm very aware of Power Rangers White Lantern. I don't know if that's just like the circles I hang out in and stuff. It's just like, I see a lot of people who aren't even Green Lantern fans bring him up just because it's a very like anime-esque thing for Western comics to have a system of power of these various different powers and then one person who can wield all of them at once. That's like, and it has this cool transformation, and it's white, so it's immediately incredibly like badass. But there's also a black counterpart, which is definitely that lends itself to much more of a. And I think this is kind of the thing, you just by telling me how his story progresses there, where he goes to different places and he learns everything. I think I'm kind of figuring out now why he isn't the Green Lantern in like the public consciousness, or why he hasn't ever become the lead, despite having, like you say, being the Green Lantern for so long. Well, Hal wasn't away, and he did a lot more than Hal ever did in terms of just like legacy. And if you were to compare their feats next to each other, like obviously Kyle's like a greater Lantern. It's kind of like the Wally thing, where because they have such a good beginning, middle, and then a climax where like all of everything goes full circle and they have an arc, that also lends themselves much more to endings and to having, okay, this is a story and this story is told. Whereas someone like Hal, and even someone like John Stewart, because they're more of a blank slate, they just extend themselves to long-running storytellings, which is what Western comics is a lot more. Like Kyle Rayner, the way you describe him, feels like a manga character, where he has a journey from the bottom to the top.
That's a really interesting way to look at it, and yeah, I could totally see it. Just out of curiosity, real quick, I googled White Lantern Kyle action figure. There are customs that exist. It looks like they made one of the DC chess pieces. There's a Hero Click and there's a Funko Pop, but there is no proper action figure of
Sucks.
Kyle Rayner as a White Lantern, and it's just it should have been. It really should have been. You can become him in the Lego Batman 3 Beyond Gotham game. You can become White Lantern Kyle Rayner. But yeah, no, that should have been a thing, and it's just, yeah, it does have so much potential, and like the thing about it was I really liked that book so much, New Guardians, because it was just kind of like, after he got the White Ring, it's not, yeah, you're right, technically the story could kind of be over there, but then it's just Kyle and Carol Ferris and the Guardians of Oa going planet to planet, and it's very Star Trek. It's very Star Trek at that point. So it's just kind of these nice little one and done stories, and like there's this, the way they start using Kyle's mastery of the different emotions is really cool, because it's not just like before I get into that, there's an issue with Kyle like leaving Oa with the White Ring, and Hal puts up a construct of a stop sign, but it's green, and Kyle's like, Hal, I'm getting mixed messages from your construct here. And Hal goes, oh, I can't paint with all the colors like you. It's just really cute, kind of fun. But like they started really doing some interesting stuff with Kyle's powers, and it wasn't just like, okay, now he's going to make a big fist, but it's red or purple or whatever. Like, they're on a planet, and the two Psi, and they're like two species, and they're at war with each other, and Kyle and the Guardians are caught in the middle of a fire, kind of stuck in a no man's land, and to get out of it, Kyle uses Indigo Light of Compassion to make both sides feel for each other, so they stop firing. And that's just the coolest shit to me. I guess that'd be a really good way to kind of transition and talk about kind of the elephant in the room, which is Omega Men.
Yeah.
Because that was the biggest problem I had with Omega Men. You know, obviously I love Tom King, but like that single power right there, that's just demonstrated as a one-off in his story, that kind of solves everything that happens in Omega Men by the time Kyle gets the ring back. Unfortunately, for better or worse, and it's, you know, obviously writers are perfectly within their rights to ignore stuff left and right. It's comics. I don't expect, I'm not shitting on King for that at all. It's just, once Kyle becomes a god, yeah, it's kind of hard to write him in compelling situations. I mean, we do get a little bit to the Superman problem there. Like, what do you challenge him with?
Because, like, although Superman does have, like, the general thing of, like, okay, Superman can be seen as too powerful by some writers and stuff, but how a lot of good writers get around that is, like, Superman's got a really strong supporting cast. Superman's main villain doesn't want to fight him physically anyway. It's Lex Luthor and his intelligences all the time, so Superman lends himself to, you can do good Superman stories without ever doing conflict. And Kyle Rayner, like you mentioned with that story, he kind of has that, not only with like the compassion to two different warring sides, but even in Omega Men, his first result is to always try and spread peace without conflict first. You can kind of get a little Jesus-y with that, but I think it maybe works better for him than it does for Superman, because he comes from a place of bearing the will of an ancient thing that he came from nothing and then rises to like sainthood. Like, I think that works kind of well for Kyle. But you also get this interesting thing is like, okay, you have to come down to the point of what is it apart from just powers, and because this has been my biggest contention with Kyle, because I think he's fine, but I never really could get into him, because how do you write someone feeling all five emotions at once and then make that a compelling character and not just a blank slate?
And I think that's kind of where Kyle's like charm comes in, because like and King definitely managed to capture that in Omega Men. Like Omega Men got marketed kind of in an interesting way with these like hostage tapes of Kyle Rayner after he'd been captured by the Omega Men, and like they finally let him talk in the last one, and he goes, "Hey Carol, I'll be fine, I promise." And like that's kind of the just like you're in the most horrible situation ever from his perspective, and he's just the first thing he does is tell his girlfriend, "I'm gonna be all right. I'll get through this." Like that's kind of cute. That's kind of fun. That's just like a very Kyle thing. He's just this not carefree, but he's just got such a cool charm to him. Like I remember in the Green Lantern core book in the old 52, there's this really interesting section where Kyle talks about like the mess, or no, it's Warriors, the Bar Warriors, that Guy Gardner set up on Oa. He recreated his tavern on Oa, and Kyle decides, I want to paint the ceiling as kind of like a mural of the history of the Green Lantern Corps, and there's just like this whole issue of Kyle. He makes a construct out of scaffolding, or he makes the scaffolding out of a construct, and he's just kind of laying there, and you're kind of getting it all from the ceiling's perspective of him painting, and all these other aliens come in, they're like, "What you doing? Painting? Can I help?" "Sure, just no constructs unless it's really basic." And it's just such a cool little neat thing of you got this guy who's just kind of simple on the surface, but just has a lot of heart to him, a lot of like just very endearing qualities is I think the thing about Kyle Rayner. Because Hal Jordan and to some extent Jon Stewart are relatively blank slate characters, but Kyle has this just instant likability to him. It's kind of hard to hate Kyle Rayner.
I think that's a good comparison then when we're comparing him to like Dick Grayson and Wally West, is because those two also kind of have that to different degrees, and Wally kind of has the same thing as Kyle, is where the majority of the hardcore fan base, be it Green Lanterns or Flash, do seem to prefer them, like Wally and Kyle, to Hal and maybe Green Lantern's different, but from people I know, I see a lot of people like hyping up Hal more than I do see Hal, and it's Barry. I think everyone accepts that Wally's way more popular than Barry.
Yeah, and I think that's just kind of the lot he was given. There's no denying that Green Lantern, just the whole universe got better once Hal Jordan came back and Jeff Johns wrote him, and honestly, I don't think the story would have worked if it was Kyle. I really don't. Kyle's stories were very different, and you kind of needed the whole Corps to come back, and part of Kyle's thing was he was off on his own. All the universe had was him, and that created a very different dynamic. And if you brought the Corps back, it would make it feel, if you brought the Corps back without Hal and you just made it Kyle, trying to lead the Corps into a brave new future, it'd make it feel kind of like he failed almost. Whereas bringing Hal back and the Corps back, all that back at once, did really make it feel fresh and powerful again. But to kind of round back to Omega Men, because that is just a case of, I love Tom King, and I know for whatever reason he gets a lot of hate. Omega Men's like the one time where I can really see where some of that criticism comes from. Because he does have a tendency to kind of write his interpretation of the character and not necessarily throw previous versions to the wind, but certainly he doesn't let it affect his take. I don't think Tom King's the type to say, like, my take is the only take that matters and all these other ones can go jump off a bridge. But yeah, he really does not let previous versions that may contradict or undercut his take interfere with the story he wants to tell. And so you get this really, really interesting, complex story that has a lot of metaphorical connections to the Iraq War and more generally to U.S. involvement in the Middle East. And that's told through Kyle, and it's this very traumatic experience for Kyle, as if he were, an American soldier who'd kind of lived through that whole era. And yeah, it's really, really interesting, really important storytelling, but there is kind of an underlying thing as a Kyle Rayner fan that I have to push back on a little bit and be like, yeah, it's a really interesting story, but you undercut a lot of Kyle's development. This does feel like a weird place to take things for Kyle after the ascension to the White Lantern title. Like, it's interesting, and it definitely, depowers him enough that you can still demonstrate that there are threats. It created an interesting weakness that I never thought of, which is, like, he just gets so overwhelmed that he can't properly use the White Ring anymore because he can't... You can only feel absolute undying rage so much. You can only feel absolute compassion so much. You can only feel hope so much before you just emotionally burn out. And that's kind of the problem he ran into, is he was emotionally drained in the most literal sense of the word. I thought that was really interesting, but at the same time, this experience was so traumatic to the character that it's really not a surprise that he couldn't remain the White Lantern, because it kind of, it just took him off the board for so long. And we weren't telling stories with Kyle as the White Lantern anymore. We were telling stories with Kyle as the Omega Lantern. And that's a very different thing.
Yeah, it is very much feels to me like if we're gonna go with because White Lantern Ascension is obviously very indicative of like religious imagery, be it like it doesn't have to be Christian, but it's a religious image of just a pure white ascension to power or like enlightenment and feeling all things, everything at once. It's like the entirety of the color spectrum versus the absence of it in black. And then you take a character like that, you take a character who fits in a Star Trek universe, who his first words are peace and compassion to conflict, and he succeeds in solving that. And you basically take Jesus and you throw him in the Iraq War, and you see how he comes out of that. And while I sympathize with you, because I can see that you have like a very deep love for this character, and you've read a lot of his stories, and there's always going to be an attachment there, especially if he's a character that you start off with your love of a universe, be it Green Lantern, and you attach to that character, and then you see them grow. Like, that's obviously going to be an important thing, and seeing someone get so beat down when they were so hopeful and just completely give up by the end of Omega Man, and this is... It's a heavy thing to deal with. Tom King just likes breaking our hearts. But at the same time, I'm like, who else of the big Justice Leaguers could you have really got away with telling that story with? I'm kind of glad it happened.
No, that's totally fair. I absolutely agree with you. It's probably more valuable than anything else we would have necessarily done with Kyle as the White Lantern, particularly, seeing him get... I mean, I think we got a story arc or two into Rebirth before they made Kyle go back to Green. It's particularly sad, but at the same time, it's probably more important than anything else we would have gotten, and it doesn't contradict, it doesn't undercut Kyle's journey to becoming the White Lantern. Is the thing that I really will say I like about Omega Men. Like, Tom King, yes, he did something, he made Kyle go through a traumatic experience. He didn't take away the ring. He didn't, make it so Kyle could never do that again. That was DC editorial, and I believe it was Robert Vidaiti, I don't know how to pronounce his name, that ended up, deciding to bring Kyle back to Green. So it's not like I blame Tom King for that, but it definitely had an effect. I don't think there's any denying that.
Yeah, but at the same time, it's like it kind of goes to me as I kind of have this with Daredevil, is because these characters, and from what you've said of Carl, he seems to have this, is like he's not so much a character where, like Batman, where there'll be individual stories you can read on their own. There'll be like 6 issues, and they'll be like fantastic. And then you can read a different one. It will have nothing to do with it, but like it is equally fantastic or more. And you can just keep doing those stories forever. With someone like Daredevil or Kyle or even like Spider-Man, it is very dependent on a hero's journey or a hero's rise and fall and rise again. And what happened prior informs it. Even if you don't have to read it, it enhances the reading experience. And then giving that an ending where it's a lot bleaker than the initial hope could have maybe led to it, I understand why that doesn't really work, and probably why DC wanted to make him a Green Lantern again. It's very hard to market the fucking guy who had everything but then went to war and then lost everything. Like, that doesn't really sell things as much as we would buy like that Omega Lantern Kyle Rayner figure. I think just he's the artist Green Lantern is more appealing to what DC wants him to be, because they don't want him to replace Hal Jordan. They just want him to be another member of Hal Jordan's cast.
Yeah, and like that's the only thing I'll say about that, and I think this would be a good point to wrap up, is the biggest problem I have with making Kyle a Green Lantern again is it exacerbates the problem of there are too many human Green Lanterns. When Kyle went off and became the White Lantern, it's like a big deal because it takes a human Green Lantern off the board without shitting on the character or killing him. It lets him move on. It lets him become something better. And for a while in continuity, they were doing some really good steps. When Guy was off trying to reform the Red Lanterns and not make them space punishers, it worked. It really did. It had a purpose and a direction, and it took a Green Lantern off the board without destroying the character. Like those, you could have done the same thing with John, and he probably would have been a lot better off for it. Or at least, just kept John on as one of the Green Lanterns on Earth. And then now you got, like, Simon and Jessica. Simon, I have no idea what to do with. Jessica, I've never been so in love with a character that I've barely read. So take that how you will. But, like, just... these are natural things to do with them that kind of, keep them in universe, keep them in wheelhouse, offer a little bit of variety, but don't require, don't require the problem of, why are there so many human Green Lanterns? So yeah, Kyle Rayner is an interesting case study in continuity fuckery.
Yeah, he's a very Marvel DC character.
Yes, that's a very good way to put it. I agree with that. I think that's a great place to end. Alfie, thanks for doing this, man. This was fun.
No worries, man. Happy to do it. I've learned a lot more about a character.
Yeah, let's go ahead and go on to recommendations. I'll do some deeper pulls, so you can take probably the more obvious one. So I'm gonna recommend the Superman the Animated Series episode of Kyle Rayner, because for just making him Hal Jordan's origin, he still does maintain a little bit of Kyle-ness, which is cool. I've talked up a storm about it here, but yes, go out and buy all the back issues of Green Lantern New Guardians. They never truly collected that series properly in trade. It's just better to buy it in issues because it'll read better, even though parts of those there's like entire sections of the issues that are crossovers. It's fine. I didn't read the crossovers. I just read the issues. It was fine. And then the third pull, I'm going to have to try to remember the issue. Well, fine, I'm not going to try to remember the specific issues. But his time as one of the mainstays on the Green Lantern Corps book pre-New 52 was really good, particularly the arc where he's, sitting there painting the ceiling of Warriors. It's a cool little time. So yeah. Alfie, what will you recommend for Kyle Rayner?
Well, again, just to be in good faith, I'm going to stick with stuff I've actually read. But I think maybe don't read these two back to back, because it would be like completely jarring to see. So Morrison's JLA run, where Kyle Rayner kind of acts as the audience surrogate. where he's the rookie on the block with all of these like amazing godlike heroes, and a lot of his like characterization and the imagination aspect are really brought to the fore there, which will like be later brought up in Green Lantern proper. So I think that's a really good place to start for him. And then, of course, don't read this straight after because you'll be like, what happened to this poor boy? Then Omega Man is kind of like the best thing I've read with Kyle in it. It's heartfelt, it's heart-wrenching, it's heartbreaking, and it's very rare to see such a prominent, big-name superhero character get this kind of there's no safety net for Kyle in this book.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. I'm sorry, I was really happy with where we were wrapping up, but I do have to mention one thing, which is a really hilarious joke I came up with. Because the one weird thing about about Green Lantern New Guardians is Kyle and Carol Ferris start dating in that book, and it's weird and it's a little awkward, but it always led me to the greatest joke in the world because the whole time Kyle was the Green Lantern in like the Justice League book and all throughout the 90s, anytime he had a crossover, anyone would be like, "You're good, kid, but you know Hal Jordan." And so my little headcanon is the first time Kyle and Carol slept together, he's like, "So how'd I do?" And she's like, "You're good, kid, but you know Hal Jordan."
Wow, but Tish, that's all she wrote, folks.
All right, until next time, I'm the Philosopher.
And I'm a terrified geek for fun.
And we are your geeky gentlemen, and we will be discussing things.